Kia ora. I want to begin by acknowledging the ancestors of this land on whose expulsion and colonization we sit, and that constitutes the fundamental infrastructure on which I'm speaking today. I want to take this moment also to thank my ancestors who have taught me the importance of social justice as the anchor to the generation of knowledge. I want to thank those union organizers, activists, left party organizers, anti-colonial protesters that form the basis of the conversation that I'm going to join into today. I also finally want to thank Lee for organizing this special panel that brings together some of my favorite scholars to think about and discuss what open science looks like and what the conversation on open science ought to be looking at as we consider the horizon. I'm going to frame my talk in terms of the question of epistemicide, the usage of colonial tools to fundamentally erase sites of knowledge production in the global south, and discuss the ways in which we can resist epistemicide through the active work of building knowledge infrastructures. The way this talk will be presented then is that I will begin by discussing the question of epistemicide as the setting for framing the culture-centered approach, which is the approach that I've been working on over the last 2 decades, with the question of what does it mean to listen to voices at the subaltern margins that have historically and systematically been erased from discursive spaces. I will then discuss the question of subaltern science and indigenous knowledge production, the ways in which indigenous knowledge intervenes into hegemonic structures of knowledge production, and how then does that offer an imaginary for indigenous futures. What I have for you here as a way to frame this conversation is an image of a women, mostly Dalit or untouchable women, organized within the context of India's agrarian margins, India's rural margins, in the backdrop of the large-scale epidemic of farmer suicides in India. And they're organizing to put forth and to circulate an indigenous form of agriculture that is embedded in indigenous science and indigenous practice, but also is deeply committed to interrupting and disrupting the neo-colonial, neoliberal project. So this work of the women takes the form of the Millet Network, which is anchored in the production of and the circulation of millets as climate-resistant crops that are embedded in indigenous livelihoods and indigenous struggles. So the concept of epistemicide is rooted in the acknowledgement that the production of knowledge, and more specifically, the production of scientific knowledge, is a colonial capitalist project. Knowledge itself as an instrument works to perpetuate capital, to create new markets for capital, while at the same time colonizing new spaces, bringing these spaces under the control of capital. In fact, the frontiers of contemporary neoliberalism constitute new forms of colonialism that venture into indigenous lands, indigenous livelihoods, in order to expel indigenous peoples from their spaces of living, and B, to co-opt indigenous forms of knowledge in order to circulate capital and create new extractive zones of profiteering. So the project of science, in this sense, is embedded in the logics of whiteness, the norms of whiteness, the principles of whiteness that use science and deploy science in particular ways in order to exclude sciences from the margins. Here, the key point to note is that the margins then are actively created through works of erasure. The processes of communicative erasure, the processes of delegitimization, the processes of stigmatization, the processes of stealing off the agency of subaltern peoples works precisely to prop up a form of science that perpetuates the colonial exercise. And within this colonial exercise then is the concept of colonial theft. We of course witness that in the form of biopiracy, the stealing of indigenous germplasm, indigenous life, indigenous biologies in order to create networks of profiteering. But we also see it in terms of the stealing of indigenous spaces, indigenous land, indigenous sites of inhabiting, water, mountains, those spaces that are considered sacred, often under the rhetoric of science and through the deployment of technologies of science. So although the argument, of course, often goes that, oh, you have to separate science from the specific techniques and technologies, from an indigenous standpoint, science itself is an instrument of whiteness that holds up and reproduces these technologies. So the kind of techno-deterministic solutions that are put forth to address global crises then work to perpetuate these new forms of colonization. A great example of this, for instance, is if you look at the sustainable futures and the framework of sustainable science that is put forth, it is often again embedded within the hegemonic structures of colonization while simultaneously erasing the subaltern communities from the margins. So colonial destruction in that sense is inherent in the production of transnational markets. Indigenous livelihoods, forms of living must be destroyed so that markets can be created, markets can be upheld, and markets can be circulated across spaces. So this work of epistemicide, the erasure of indigenous ways of knowledge generation, of indigenous knowledge claims, is both material and symbolic. At the symbolic level, it works through the deployment of colonial communication infrastructures that are consistently at work to delegitimize indigenous knowledge, to stigmatize indigenous knowledge in order to create the market mechanisms for hegemonic white science. At the same time, the violence is material because in order to carry out these expulsions and extractions, indigenous peoples must be removed from their spaces of livelihood, often through the use of force, through the deployment of the police and the military. So you see this in the frontiers of neoliberal capital, that the ongoing attacks of capital are deployed through the arms of the state, through the deployment of the military, paramilitary, and the police in order to murder, in order to incarcerate, and then fundamentally in order to silence indigenous voices of protest. So the question then with respect to the problem of epistemicide is, how do we take the challenge for open science and decolonize it in ways that interrogate its whiteness and that interrogates its normative logics that perpetuate the colonial capitalist project. So decolonization in this sense is not about creating an invitational dialogic space, but it is fundamentally anti-colonial. It is resistive in its urgency, in seeking to dismantle the forms, the structures, and the spaces of knowledge production that are embedded in logics of whiteness. Because whiteness in its colonial forms is violence, because whiteness in its colonial form is murder. Whiteness in its colonial forms is extraction and expulsion. So from an indigenous standpoint, the problem of decolonization, or the challenge of decolonization, is one of actually taking down the sides that perpetuate whiteness and its logics, dismantling those spaces where science is generated and where the narrative of science is deployed precisely to erase, precisely to expel, and to create new markets through these processes of expulsion, disrupting the claims of open science and the logics that constitute these claims. So, decolonizing framework invites us to interrogate the fundamental ideologies that are embedded in the ideas of openness. So, who sets the terms of openness? Who operationally defines what is open, for what purposes, and to serve whose purposes? If you, for instance, take the simple idea of transparency from the standpoint of indigenous struggles, or when you locate this question of transparency amidst indigenous struggles, you realize, or you recognize, that in fact, transparency and its tools pretty much have served to colonize. So the language of transparency has often been used in order to steal the indigenous life forms, indigenous bioforms, indigenous knowledge systems, and indigenous science, in order to incorporate them into the white man's narrative of conquest and circulation. So the urgency of the indigenous future then is in recognizing logics such as transparency and the colonial habits that are written into such logics. Similarly, an indigenous interrogation points to the question of data. Who gathers the data? This is especially important when indigenous bodies, indigenous genes, the indigenous DNA is incorporated into colonizing circuits of profiteering, while at the same time carrying out the expulsion, erasure, and violence on indigenous peoples. So these questions of data and transparency from the perspective of decolonization have to be anchored in questions of sovereignty, data sovereignty in terms of ownership of data and ownership of information, research sovereignty in terms of sovereignty over the research process, turning this lens of ownership on its head and really asking the question of where are those infrastructures placed, where knowledge is generated to serve whom, and really working in resistance to hegemonic structures to locate or to move these infrastructures into indigenous domains of knowledge generation that serve the life goals, the agentic imaginaries of indigenous communities embedded very much in the struggles for indigenous life and livelihood. So how do we then safeguard infrastructures of indigenous science? This is a critical question, and this is particularly so because of the violence that is often deployed in order to co-opt and steal indigenous science. So we have an image here of the women farmers in south of India, in Telangana, India, who organize in sanghams or women's cooperatives, working with the women's ways of knowing agriculture and the science of agriculture to map out and plan how they are going to cultivate in the next season. So what you see here as an image is the women sitting together using chalk to mark out fields and then using branches, trees, leaves in order to create a planting pattern. And then this sort of decision making is guided by the evidence that they have created from earlier agricultural cycles, from the everyday work of observation, and from the everyday work of challenging the structures of neoliberal cooptation. So this then, in terms of safeguarding the space, is also about safeguarding the various tools of violence, all the way from agriculture extension to the advertising and promotional efforts that are put forth by transnational corporations and the nation state in order to carry out this form of expulsion. So this really then leads to how do we intervene into the hegemonic structures of science with indigenous knowledge practices. So the question of openness and what constitutes openness is not discussed in elite cosmopolitan circuits located elsewhere, is not discussed and held control over in ICA conference sessions and in theme sessions, but rather is actually articulated, practiced, and put forth from within indigenous struggles, from within the struggles for voice, and from within the struggles for methodology, systematic observation, and the generation of scientific knowledge. So the culture-centered approach situated in this conversation invites us, offers us a methodological impetus to imagine the work of generating knowledge as cultivating in the words of Gayatri Spivak, as cultivating the habits of learning to learn from below. So what does it mean to learn from below? And in this process, then continually decolonize and open up spaces that are committed to the struggles from below. How do we cultivate a habit of patient listening to an ethic of the other that is always and ever committed to the notion of erasure, to the recognition that the ways in which we participate in the production of science, in the creation and circulation of metrics, actually work to silence, to erase, and to perpetuate violence. And through this process, then how do we work toward another imagination, which fundamentally is about inversion of the dominant structures of knowledge making and knowledge circulation. So in order to create these infrastructures, the culture-centered approach argues that we need to think about how we build communicative infrastructures that are anchored in equality, equality for opportunities for information, information related to specific claims making of science, information related to methodology, information related to representation, and resources for representation in terms of who is doing the work of representing. So if you think about it in terms of communication research, when subaltern bodies are often scripted into hegemonic structures of communication knowledge in order to be written about by experts elsewhere, the question here becomes one of how do we decolonize these infrastructures of representation so that the processes of representation are owned by communities that are systematically erased. How do we co-create infrastructures for decision-making? And fundamentally then, how do we co-create infrastructures for voice? So communicative equality is about voice equality, about building opportunities for erased voices to be heard and for those registers to emerge as registers for imagining other possibilities. So ownership here relates to sort of 6 different forms of ownership that I could think of. One is ownership of knowledge infrastructures, where we make knowledge claims. Ownership of knowledge infrastructures for method, where we claim method as well as discuss method. Ownership of information infrastructures in terms of decision-making processes, who makes these decisions. In the context of the women's lives and livelihoods, they articulate that these decisions are often made by elite post-colonial men working together with elite institutions in the global north, all the way from development agencies to United Nations agencies to academic institutions in the north that determine the forms of agriculture that would work, that would often be considered sustainable in order to be disseminated in communities. And here what is critical to recognize is that the terms of engagement are precisely co-opted in order to serve the agendas of neoliberal capital. So when you hear the term engagement in science communication and open science, the idea of engagement is built upon the logics of colonization, where to engage is to identify new channels in order to disseminate science. In other words, in order to perpetuate the colonizing project of white science. So how then, in the backdrop of this, do we build infrastructures for decision making that are rooted in the struggles of subaltern communities of the global margins? How do we build resources for voice in terms of decision making method and then making knowledge claims? So here you have an image, and the women talk about this in the ongoing work of the Deccan Development Society, which is a collective of cooperatives or sanghams, where they come together to challenge this neoliberal onslaught of commercialized capitalist agriculture. And they say that if you look at where this information is disseminated, if you look at the communication channels, they have been colonized. So when you look at radio, when you look at pamphlets that disseminate this information about biotechnology, about profit-driven agriculture, they take place through communication channels that are fundamentally co-opted in capitalist logics. One has to pay high amounts of advertising rupees in order to place their messages on these channels. So it is really those with power, those with economic access, and those with political access that then tell the story of science, the practice of science, and the forms of knowledge that are presented as what would work. So for the women in their struggle then, the struggle for science and sovereignty in knowledge production, or what one might call as science sovereignty, is about communicative sovereignty. So how do we build spaces of communication that are owned by us within decolonizing contexts, and that create frameworks for our participation anchored in logics that we have created, rooted in our cultural lives, rather than forms of top-down engagement imposed by the status quo. So I want to walk through a couple of examples to demonstrate what I mean by voice infrastructures embedded in this idea of communication sovereignty and material interventions. As you will see here, the voice infrastructures are very much embedded in the materiality of everyday life and everyday struggles within this context for a say over agriculture, for a say over ecosystems and ecologies. What do you do when communicative spaces and architectures and infrastructures have been colonized? Within this context, then, within the context of this particular anti-colonial struggle, it is the bullock carts embedded within the fabric of community life, the songs, the seed banks, the traveling seed banks that you can see that are carrying the seeds that belong in community, embedded in community life, rather than the seeds manufactured by transnational corporations that can only be bought and sold through the market. The street processions as they walk from village to village, these become the material sites for articulation. These are the voice architectures that are also the architectures for claims making and opening up science. So the process of co-creating communication infrastructures then is one about building spaces of communication sovereignty. Spaces where claims can be made by those at the global margins, margins that are actively created by the processes of extraction and expulsion, and participate from these margins in terms that are determined by those at the margins, embedded within logics determined by those at the margins. How do we then build plural networks of solidarity that become ways of opening up science through conversations embedded in the everyday methods of struggles of the grassroots and at the subaltern margins? How do we connect across spaces in these struggles? And through these connections, how do we intervene into hegemonic structures? And the work of the women with millets as a climate-resistant crop is a great example, because through that process, then they build the millet network that then brings this form of knowledge generation and this science of knowledge generation across spaces that travels across the global south. But what is also critical to note here is the importance of resistance and keeping intact the resistive politics. And that essentially means that one has to continually monitor, evaluate, and challenge the hegemonic structures that seek to co-opt and colonize. So how does generation of millets embedded in indigenous science then challenge the co-optive moves by the Gates corporations, the Gates Foundation, by transnational corporations to then take the millet and turn it into a commodity to profit global capital while actually excluding the women? So the struggle for indigenous science is also the struggle against hegemonic structures and building and sustaining bioresistance. So the work of bioresistance is the process of making claims through science and through the process of evidence making embedded within indigenous context, but also retaining the ownership over these claims within these contexts. So the question of science in this setting is turned on its head. For many indigenous struggles, it is about, the question is about not just what we can share in order to create global frameworks and to build global spaces of resistance, but also what do we keep? What do we not share? What knowledge do we keep with us so that this is not turned into another site of colonization? So I will wrap up with playing a song from the women's work with agriculture and their struggle. Here they are singing to the seeds, and singing itself becomes a site for performing bioresistance. And then I will wrap up with this concept of communication sovereignty as a basis for decolonizing science. The concept of communication sovereignty then is about building and sustaining these communicative spaces that are owned by those at the margins of the margins. Through these processes of ownership, building and sustaining material practices that are embedded in science and the processes of observation, the processes of drawing inferences based upon observation and developing theories, and at the same time embedded within the futures of indigenous sovereignty. And through these struggles for voice and ownership over scientific processes of decision making, interrogating sites of power, both power held by the state as well as power held by capital, and the ways in which then these networks of power are circulated through systems of knowledge production. So I want to wrap up by discussing the work of the indigenous Guatemalan activist Rigoberta Menchú, when she says that there are some stories that I'm going to share, and there are many others that I'm not going to share. This idea, this active idea of not sharing, of keeping as a way for resisting the processes of colonization is a vital register for conversations as we imagine open science, particularly within the context of contemporary global struggles of inequality, attacks on indigenous livelihoods, and climate change. Thank you so much for participating. Please do post your comments and I'll be happy to respond to them. And it's really lovely to be on this panel, engaged with other speakers that are asking similar questions that critically interrogate the ideas of open science. Thank you.
Tēnā rā koutou katoa, aku mihi nui nei ki te ti ki te tā huri no I te ao, ko te tūmana ko ia, kei te noho haumaru tonu te katoa. Welcome to this presentation titled Theorising Māori Health and Wellbeing, Voices from the Margins. This is an ethnographic collaboration with some tribal members of the local iwi Ngāti Kaupata, situated in Fielding, Manawatu, Aotearoa, New Zealand. It is anchored in the cultural-centred approach with emphasis on the connection between land, local rivers, and health and wellbeing. The cultural-centred approach is a meta-theoretical framework designed by Professor Mohan Datta. It illuminates structural inequalities and foregrounds voice from communities who are positioned on the margins of societies. Communicative inequalities are interlinked with material inequalities, structural inequalities, socio-economic inequalities. As we all know, not all relationships are created equal. Therefore, not all relationships within communities are equal. Not all relationships within tribal nations are equal. The articulations of these lived experiences of inequalities, together with the co-creation of strategies and solutions by these communities, mark the CCA approach. As discussed by Professors Mohan Datta and Collins Ehibinbua, culture is both dynamic and static. Culture reflects the shared meanings of values, practices, and meanings. These can be passed down through the generations. They can also be transformed over time and in response to crises. Structure is about the systems of organising, complete with its rules about who can participate and who cannot, and how that participation should be conducted. Values also underpin structure. These are often hegemonic and ethnocentric in nature as they prop up neoliberal agendas. Agency is expressed through the daily navigation of structural constraints. So in the CCA, at the intersections of culture, structure, and agency, voices emerge that often call into question or interrogate the workings of structure whilst articulating cultural-centred meanings and reimaginings. Excuse me. This is the geographical area of Fielding, Manawatu, Aotearoa, New Zealand. On the right here, there is a map of New Zealand. And where the cursor is, if you can see it, yep, that's pretty much where the Manawatu is. And on the left, the green carved out area of the Manawatu includes Fielding, which is about 20 kilometres north of Palmerston, which is the nearest city. Fielding is a part of the Ngāti Kaupata tribal area. I am also a Ngāti Kaupata tribal member, so in this collaboration I'm positioned as an insider-outsider researcher. Professor Linda Smith talks about this more, insider-outsider researchers within Indigenous nations. Insider because I belong to the local iwi of Ngāti Kaupata, and outsider because I am at the university and have the privileges of this position and Western education. So, who are the margins of the margins? And in the context of tribal nations, I often get asked, aren't we all marginalised? So, This is because this question keeps being raised because as tribal nations, whānau who comprise tribal nations are related by genealogy. We can cite a common ancestor. In my iwi, we can go back up to around 8 generations to identify a common ancestor. And some of the larger iwis, they go beyond 8 generations to cite a common ancestor. So therefore, this idea that framing and positioning whānau members as the margins of the margins is divisive and exclusionary in itself props up communicative inequalities. The simple facts are these. Some of us have greater access to information, resources and voice platforms than others. Therefore, we are not all positioned equal. This reality produces questions such as who has the power in our tribal nations? How is it reproduced to erase voice and maintain expert domination in our communities? Whose voices are not heard in mainstream and tribal discursive spaces? The CCA methodology looks deeper and wider for these types of erasures. For example, in this study, tribal leaders and or representatives on committees, be they in mainstream spaces or tribal spaces, are not participants. Apart from the consideration of socio-economic inequalities, I also looked at who is doing the representing and who is not. 30 whānau participants engaged in this study, most comprised the local iwi, Ngāti Kaupata. Other participants either have children who are Ngāti Kaupata tribal members or they have a spouse who is a tribal member. Their ages ranged between 18 to 70 years. In-depth interviews, in-depth open-ended questions that simply asked, what does health and wellbeing mean to you? How is land connected to health and wellbeing? As well as an array of other questions, built infrastructures for listening and meaning making. This idea that whānau with lived realities of socio-economic and community inequalities are best represented by others within our tribal nations because these representatives are better positioned to raise issues on behalf of all really needs examining. The co-constructed meanings of health and wellbeing and the connection to land, rivers and the environment as articulated by whānau participants in phase 1 of the CCA research project provides alternative imaginaries for voice democracy. In phase 2, platforms for voice were co-created with participants. And during this stage, local government seized the few remaining acres of ancestral land to build a stop bank to prevent flooding in the community. To end this presentation, here is a video co-created by whānau as they occupied their land and called into question hegemonic local government consultative processes. I'm happy to engage in further dialogue or try to answer any questions as I see them. Thank you for joining and watching this video.
Since 1828, around those times our tupuna come down here. We took possession of this land on purpose because of this river over here, Orowa. By the time it come to the 1860s, Waikato land wars, Taranaki land wars, through to the 1880s, we went to court many times and we lost most of our land. It was given 11,000 acres between 5 chiefs. Of that 11,000 acres, today in 2020 we own probably under 50 acres. When they push the people off the maraes with their great big urbanisation push and certain laws, people potted our people around in towns and that, so they couldn't be communal. We don't have much left, and they're still trying to take some off us.
Horizons never got permission from us, Tiara or Rehua Trust, to go onto our land, which they have already done.
We at Ngāti Kaupata, we the landowners of this piece of land here, are going to fight.
Yeah, after losing so much land as an iwi and hapu, I feel it's time to stand and represent my aunties, my kuia, and the tamariki that are going to come. We don't have a lot, like I said, and not one more acre. There's been one of the Pākehā farmers, he's agreed to let us occupy some of his land too. He gave them permission to put the stop bank somewhere over there, but instead they've chosen to swallow up all this land and start their stop bank on Māori land. It's just a modern day form of confiscation, that's what it feels like.
We're going to be here, we're going to stay here until it's all finished and we'll get this taken back over towards the awa.
Tēnā rā koutou katoa, e mihi ana ki ngā mana, ki ngā reo, ki ngā āhuatanga katoa, e pāngi ana kia tātou, o tira ki ngā āhuatanga e whakahere ana i a tātou. Welcome to our ICA Health Communication presentation titled Culturally Centering Indigenous Voice from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Introducing our presenters, first Dr. Phoebe Ehlers, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at CARE, Centre for Cultural Centred Approach to Research and Evaluation in the School of Communication, Journalism and Marketing at Massey University, New Zealand. She received her PhD from the School of Communication Studies at Auckland University of Technology in 2018. Her primary research interests include health communication, information and communication technologies in healthcare, and critical and cultural studies. Pooja Jayan is a junior researcher and PhD student at CARE at Massey University. In her research projects in New Zealand and India, she engaged with migrants, refugees, underprivileged children and women, and minority communities experiencing marginalisation. I am Ngaho or Christine Ehlers from the tribal nations of Ngāti Kaupata, Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, Ngāti Maniapoto and Ngāti Haua in Aotearoa. I am also a junior researcher and PhD student at CARE. I am engaged in the CCA analysing Māori meanings of health and wellbeing and co-creating infrastructures for voice with whānau participants. We will provide a brief overview of the CCA and kaupapa Māori theory, followed by a snippet of the CCA community-grounded campaigns in Glen Innes, Auckland, Fielding Manawatu, and Highbury, Palmerston North, anchoring voices from the margins of communities amidst hegemonic health discourse. We'll now go to Pooja.
CCA, or the culture-centered approach, deals with subaltern classes whose voices are often erased from the dominant discursive spaces. So CCA seeks to create dialogic platforms where the people from the margins can raise their voices and create solutions in locally meaningful ways. So CCA looks at three elements to analyze how meanings are created, that is culture, structure, and agency. Culture is the everyday creation of meanings, and structure is the allocation of resources which limits access to some people, whereas it privileges some sections. And agency is the ability of human beings to negotiate these structures. In CCA, voices of the communities are at the center, and now we can listen to the voices of communities at the margins in New Zealand.
Kaupapa Māori theory was first articulated by distinguished Professor Graham Hingangaroa Smith against the backdrop of a contemporary kaupapa Māori resistance movement underpinned by Māori epistemologies, knowledge, practices, both traditional and contemporary. This is not an exhaustive account of kaupapa Māori theory, scholarship and campaign, so below there are a couple of references for more in-depth information. Kaupapa Māori theory posits Māori language, knowledge and culture as integral elements that validate and circulate Indigenous narratives into research across all domains, including health, and in so doing, interrogate hegemonic research practices by opening up possibilities for social transformation. The purpose for acknowledging kaupapa Māori theory in our paper is to pay homage to the kaupapa Māori resistance movement that has paved the way before us, and to probe further to identify spaces where the CCA and kaupapa Māori theory intersect, identifying avenues for solidarity with academics and voices from the margins of communities. We'll now go on to Dr. Phoebe Ellis's presentation.
Hi, well, I'm presenting on an ongoing project in Glen Innes, which is a low-income suburb in Auckland. The initial engagement in October 2018 with the Glen Innes community involved ethnographic research, including interviews with 60 residents. And within the Glen Innes township, there were clear social issues visible, including homelessness, unemployment, crime, substance abuse, and mental illness. But resident stories also revealed a positive side to Glen Innes, including a strong sense of community where people care and support each other. It is this community that has been central to the ongoing development of the project in Glen Innes. In May 2019, a group of residents formed an advisory board, and from that first meeting, it was clear that there was a need for alternative routes of communication that enable voice and listening. Over the next 6 months, we developed the Poverty is Not Our Future campaign, which aims to draw attention to issues relating to poverty. I'll go on to the next slide now. So in the study, I outlined instances of reflexivity as a methodological tool during this process. So for example, when we originally planned the first phase of the research, we planned to interview people who resided within this one Glen Innes boundary, which is set by the Auckland Council. But as we talked to people and we conducted interviews, we discovered that our geographical boundary were merely outlines on a map, nothing more. With many people from neighbouring suburbs identifying and seeing themselves as living in Glen Innes. And yet we were reluctant to define the community in this way. And that made us look at ourselves and question why. Why is that? In planning the campaign, we found that for the advisory board to be effective, we had to trust in the decision making of the members. So for example, while we were planning the campaign, I felt apprehensive about residents choosing to include their names and faces in the campaign. And it took me a long time to decide that I shouldn't censor participants or take away the opportunity to own the campaign messaging. I think throughout this time, what I've found is that we're not the focus as researchers in the project in Glen Innes. It's the community that are positioned as the owners of the problem configuration and corresponding solutions. But at the same time, we can't remove ourselves from it, with the research being co-constructed and shared and shaped through our lens. Having spent more than a year on the project in Glen Innes, we feel driven by the need to accurately represent the participants' narratives, continue working in partnership with the advisory board, and give back to the Glen Innes community. Thank you.
And our next CCA project is a project in Fielding, Manawatu, which involved 30 Māori participants, mostly from the local iwi, and constituted from the margins of the margins. In my presentation in Ethnicity and Race and Communication Division, I outline the method of identifying and engaging with whānau participants from the margins of the margins in that video. In-depth interviews were conducted with these participants who articulated their meanings of health and well-being from their lived experiences of entrenched systemic health inequalities. They called into question health strategies designed for them rather than with them. They sojourned outside of hegemonic healthcare discourse and articulated possibilities for a healthcare system that is centred on land, the environment, and clean waterways. These served as anchors to the reimaginings of a healthcare system, services, and communication grounded in their voices. In the ICA Health Communication Panel, New Frontiers of the CCA Approach, the Indigenous Resistance presentation by myself and Professor John Etzel, we outlined 2 CCA campaigns conducted here in Aotearoa. In the second half of that presentation, I outlined this What We Say Matters campaign, which grew out of the CCA project here in Fielding with our advisory group and is discussed in more detail in that presentation. Our third CCA campaign in Aotearoa is a campaign in Highbury, Palmerston North. It is a CCA academic community partnership, which began in Highbury in 2018. Excuse me. In-depth interviews were conducted with around 60 participants, gleaning their thoughts and experiences about poverty in the community. Dr. Terry Te Tau of the Rangitane and Ngāti Kahungunu nations in the Wairarapa was an integral part of the project. She has now left the university to continue pursuing her art career. Like the other CCA projects, a Highbury community advisory group was formed. Now 2 members of the group work for CARE and are continuing with the campaigns. With predominantly Māori, Pasifika, immigrant and refugee populations, Highbury is in many ways constitutes the margins of Palmerston North, emergent in discourse as a space to be avoided. For many participants, disrupting the stigmas around the community formed the basis for their emerging voices that Highbury is a safe zone for those who live there. This culminated in the I Choose Highbury campaign, comprising a photo voice exhibition and video campaigns, which will be uploaded to the I Choose Highbury Facebook page. Gail Moana Johnson is a key community researcher from the Highbury Advisory Group, together with Jasmine Pye, who is also from the group, and is engaged in design and social media for CARE. Both staff began work at CARE after the ICA deadlines. The CCA campaigns reflect a sense of pride in the community ties in Highbury. Across the sites of fieldwork in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the CCA has made significant strides addressing issues in ways that co-create infrastructures for marginalised communities to raise their voices and de-centre expert domination on communities. Constructing dialogic spaces where people at the margins can participate, raise their issues and give solutions in locally meaningful ways to put forth theories of health and wellbeing. The CCA encompasses ways of examining the governing knowledge structures, striving to invert the practices of dominant narratives by involving those at the margins, attending to the challenges of the communities with voice, equality, health and accessibility. To watch some of the campaign videos on Facebook, please search out Poverty is Not Our Future for Glen Innes, What We Say Matters for Fielding, and for Highbury, I Choose Highbury. CARE's technical producer Richard Torres co-created videos with our advisory groups. Richard, who is typically behind the camera, and right now he's in the background. Thank you for your production expertise and guidance. We are happy to respond to any questions as we see them. Thank you all for watching.
Kia ora. I'm so excited to be joining you to talk today about digital media, racist networks of hate and power. With this conversation, I hope to join the ongoing thread of dialogues across the globe on the role of digital media as architectures for circulating hate. Certainly, this is an issue that has been of global concern, particularly attending to the power of digital media as sites for disseminating hate, for cultivating hate, and for really reorganizing our societies on principles of hate. What I hope to achieve through this conversation is to really center the idea of power and foreground the ways in which power impacts the creation of hateful material, the circulation of hateful material, and really building networks of profiteering from hate. In a nutshell, I hope to join the thread of conversations that actually point to the notion of hate itself being a profitable industry, and connecting then the economics of hate as a site of profiteering, to the politics of hate and the ways in which then mainstream politics thrives on hate and is able to mobilize it in order to create opportunities for consolidating power in the hands of the elite. So we will begin by looking at the question and the context of digital media particularly. In talking about digital media, I will draw upon the fieldwork that I have been conducting and that CARE has been carrying out in India within the context of India's digital margins, as well as within the context of the massive growth of Islamophobia across India, particularly seeded by the digital architectures. I will then attend to the ways in which logics of digital media create openings for profiteering and actually support an entire industry that goes all the way from small-scale producers of hate to large transnational corporations that profit across the gamut from the circulation of hate. So this idea of hate as profit then will connect to the broader question of power and racism, attending to the role of racism in keeping existing power structures intact. So centering the question of power and control in the conversation on digital media, hate and racism really points toward the role of media architectures and media infrastructures in serving the political and economic elites. And then we will look at the ways in which power flows within the context of digital racism. So in that imaginary of digital, what we actually witness empirically is that the networks of flows of conversations, of images, of postings on WhatsApp, on Twitter, actually work toward consolidating power. So broadly then, I will wrap up with the argument that contrary to the more utopian narratives about digital media being emancipatory and bringing about democracy, that what really we witness is that digital media have worked to reproduce the existing power inequalities in society, reproducing these power inequalities and working to entrench power in the hands of hegemonic actors. Now let's begin with the narrative of digital media as sites, spaces, and resources of democratization. This narrative, of course, we saw it speak around the time of the uprisings within the context of Arab Spring, within the context of the number of resistance movements that we witnessed across the globe. And in this particular narrative, and you certainly see quite a bit of this reproduced uncritically in the communication literature, digital media are celebrated as democratizing spaces that empower or give power to everyday citizens and enable their participation in democratic processes, in processes of change. So at a broader level, this argument works somewhat like this, that within the context of controls over media sites held by hegemonic actors, within the context of authoritarian regimes, for instance, when we discuss the role of the dominant media being controlled, digital media then are seen as emancipatory sites, as spaces for resisting and challenging the hegemonic status quo, and for democratizing participatory spaces. So really, participatory opportunities are opened up with the growth and proliferation of digital media. Now, of course, this narrative has worked well with the digital media industries as well, with Google, IBM, Facebook claiming an emancipatory role within the context of global social movements and global social change processes. In fact, spending significant amounts of investments in training activists and training advocates across the globe on principles of democracy and democratic participation. So uncritically celebrated, this idea really refines and reproduces the techno-deterministic logic that digital media bring about transformations. They bring about democracy, and greater the penetration of digital media across the globe, the greater the opportunities for democracy. So technologies of digital media democratize. So within this backdrop, then, I would like to ask the question of the ownership of digital media and digital resources, and connect this to the broader interrogation of technology capital. So these digital media and their narratives of democracy and emancipation often obfuscate the empirical evidence that most digital media architectures, platforms, infrastructures are owned by large transnational corporations. In fact, these are some of the largest transnational corporations across the globe. And these corporations profit from the securing of audiences that participate on these digital platforms. In this sense, of course, democracy is profitable, or we should say that one particular idea of democracy through participation on these platforms is profitable. They drive the advertising revenues of technology capital, as well as they create tremendous opportunities for market segmentation, market profiling for psychographic research and psychographic profiling, and the targeting of audiences. So digital media in this sense then really are sites for consolidation of power in the context of the consolidation of power to serve the logics of capital, to secure audiences and the base that is necessary to be sold to transnational corporations to generate profit, but also in terms of serving as resources for surveillance, where these digital technologies of participation are also pretty much the same technologies that are utilized in order to surveil our everyday behaviors, in order to codify these behaviors, and then to target us by messaging that is actually anchored in gathering our data. So the tremendous consolidation of power that we witness across the globe is paradoxically tied to this narrative of democratization. Participation itself then becomes a form of profiteering. And although one might argue that this form of participation is sold as democracy, it is anything but democratic, in a sense that the architectures of the conversations, the norms within which one participates, as well as the possibilities that are opened up through participation, are very much constrained within the logics of transnational capital, within the norms, the codes, and the rules that are established by transnational capital. At the same time that we participate on these platforms, the economy of sharing, the economy of liking, the economy of commenting actually is tied to then the turning of our bodies as well as our labor as objects for profiteering. So through our labor, through our participation, through the sharing of our feelings and emotions, we actually turn into opportunities as well as networks for profiteering that supports transnational capital, as well as that hegemonic forces across societies that secure control through our management and governance. So affect or emotion within this sense is circulated across digital platforms as a site of profiteering. The capacity to extract profit and to optimize it is intrinsically tied to the ability of these networks and platforms to generate affect, to speak to affect, and then to be able to circulate affect across the platform. So greater the affect that is generated, greater the profits that are generated for transnational corporations. The emphasis then of transnational technology capital is on leveraging the capacities of the platforms to maximize affect so that greater and greater profits can be generated. Now, technology capital in this sense is also intrinsically related to the role of the state. Unlike the propaganda of neoliberal capital that projects the market as a space that freely moves and is emancipatory without the intervention of the state, the market for technology capital thrives on the role of the state in supporting it, in consolidating it, and in perpetuating its control. So there is harmonious relationship, a symbiotic relationship between state and the technologies of capital. First and foremost, digital technologies, any technology platform that we work with are platforms of surveillance. And these surveillance-based information, the data points that are gathered through surveillance are easily turned into dominant state actors for them to assert their forms of control. So when we consider the possibilities of our democratic participation, we have to critically interrogate the role that these participatory forms play in terms of supporting these technologies of surveillance and actually enabling these technologies to map us out, to map participation out so that we can be better controlled. States are also sites of violence and once again enabled by digital technologies in terms of gathering data based on our bodies, based upon our participation, and then deploying this data to control us. At the same time, the state formations that I've been speaking of enable technology capital. So it is really through the participation of the state and through a variety of policy frameworks that the movement of technology capital is enabled. And through this process of being enabled by technology capital enables the state. And that's why the back and forth symbiotic relationship. So within this structure of state, power, transnational corporations, and digital technologies, digital hate becomes a form of monetizing racism. So when we consider the deep-seated inequalities that are built in societies, often drawing upon prejudice held by the majority toward minorities, these prejudices can actually be exploited in order to serve the agendas of hegemonic political actors. Now, the technology here, the digital technology comes in as a resource or as an architecture that enables powerful political actors to draw out data, to use the data for the purposes of targeting, and to run campaigns, to run messaging that targets us, often deploying the narrative of hate, often speaking to the prejudice of the majority toward minorities. So in that sense, the political economy of hate is tied to the profitability of hate. Hate is profitable. The more hate moves through digital platforms, the greater revenues it generates, as well as the greater opportunities it generates for the consolidation of political power. So when you think about it from this kind of a framework, and you consider the various initiatives that are put forth by nation states in terms of regulating participation on digital platforms, you must carefully attend to this idea that the political actors that form the infrastructures of the state, in fact, profit from the circulation of prejudice, circulation of hate, and the deployment of hate in order to generate political opportunities. And this really forms the basic infrastructure of the hate industry. So the hate industry is a highly profitable industry that is globally distributed and that works through various networks of production and circulation to generate hate, to seed it, and then to magnify it across digital spaces. This then becomes the basis for political profiteering, such that political parties that are able to target audiences on the basis of hate by invoking hate are able to then capture the political market space. So power consolidates the sites of profiteering when we consider the question of digital hate. Certainly, I see this in my field work within the context of Islamophobia in India, that Islamophobia is actually seeded and circulated by a wide range of organizations, right from small-scale cottage industries of hate to the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Narendra Modi, all of whom across the spectrum profit from the marketing of Hindutva. Hindutva is a specific ideology of Hinduism that works by positioning Hinduism in opposition to Islam primarily, also somewhat in opposition to Christianity, and then projects this narrative of Hinduism in crisis in order to then generate messages of the Hindu revival, which becomes the basis for the political narrative of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. So when you look at the hegemony of the BJP, much of it is connected to the capacity of the BJP information technology cell to seed and circulate hate toward Muslims, particularly through digital networks and digital infrastructures. And one would argue that this digital network of hate, whether it is on WhatsApp or whether it is on Twitter, really forms the basis for the ascendance of the BJP and the political power it holds, but also in terms of its ability then to transform the entire Indian society in the logics of hate. So digital technologies in this instance work as the new frontiers of consolidation by the continuous repeating of narratives of hate, by the continuous circulation of the narratives of hate, and by the penetration of these narratives into the everyday spaces of living and livelihood through the digital networks. We actually see the consolidation of power. Digital technologies at the same time that they do this are also the new sites of precarization. So in India, while doing my field work, for instance, I find it quite powerful to witness the extent of precarization reported by India's Muslims living in a climate of fear, living in a climate of anxiety, living with the perpetual sense that one might be attacked, that one might be the target of a mob, that one might be lynched, with the false narrative of eating beef. So misinformation in the sense that is circulated to catalyze hate is also disinformation. So those in power actively seed misinformation in order to profit from it. To conclude then, what I would like to point to is that the digital networks of hate that we see across the globe are tied to positions of power. They have a fundamental economic logic that constitutes them, and they serve as the basis of creating specific state formations that entrench the power of capital. Thank you so much for joining. I'm hoping that we would be able to have a longer conversation on this topic. So please do post your questions, and I will time and again log into the session to respond to your questions. Thank you so much for participating.
Tēnā rā koutou katoa, e tukuna ana ngā whakamoeneti ki te wāhi ngaro, o tira ki te hunga taketake, e nohoi ana ki tēnā whenua, ki tēnā whenua. We acknowledge the Indigenous nations across the globe during this COVID-19 pandemic. Our prayer is that you have shelter, access to running water, food and medicine. May we continue to communicate the challenges of our everyday lived experiences and our reimaginings of social transformation and Indigenous sovereignty grounded in the voices of our whānau, families, Papua Nibi, tribal nations and communities. Pai māriri kia tātou. John G. Etzel is a professor in the Waikato Management School. He moved to Aotearoa from New Mexico, USA 9 years ago with his wife and 2 sons. Since that time, he has worked with several Māori health and wellbeing organisations to collaboratively develop interventions related to pre-diabetes and related conditions, positive ageing and housing. These projects have been funded by the National Science Challenges and represent long-standing collaboration with organisations, particularly Rawawawa Kaumātua Charitable Trust. I am from the tribal nations of Ngāti Kauwhata, Ngāti Kahungungu ki Wairarapa, Ngāti Haua and Ngāti Manipoto. I am a PhD student and a junior researcher at CARE, Centre for Cultural Centred Research and Evaluation, School of Communication, Journalism and Marketing, Massey University. My name is Ngaho Christine Allers. Professor John Etzel will begin with an overview of the Kaumātua Mana Motuhake project. My presentation will follow, providing an example of a cultural centred approach campaign grounded in the voices of some whānau of a local iwi or tribe who recently resisted local government attempts at confiscating their remaining ancestral land. Over to you, Professor John.
Ngā mihi nui, Christine. So the project that I'm going to talk about is this Kaumātua Mana Motuhake Poi. It's a research project that was funded by the National Science Challenge, and it's set up as a way to address a number of key issues associated with some of the history of colonization within Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'm speaking, as I see here in this first slide, is on behalf of the KMM POI research team. We're a large team, and I'll share a little bit about us in a second. But first, I want to move to the next slide, where we're talking about some of the key issues for Kaumatua. Kaumatua are Maori elders, and these are some of the key. So I won't spend too much time. Certainly, we could go into a presentation just about the history in New Zealand, but I just want to point out a few key issues that provide a context for what we're trying to do, and to point out the type of resistance that we're engaged with. So one key aspect is health inequities. In New Zealand, Maori have lower health outcomes in many key issues compared to Pākehā or non-Maori or European New Zealanders. So that's one of the key challenges that's being faced. A second is the history of colonization in New Zealand. And a key aspect of colonization, particularly for many Kaumatua today, is the efforts that were done through boarding schools and through different acts and political acts, was to remove culture and language, and the effect that this has on Kaumatua. So many Kaumatua are revered in Maori culture, and they have important roles around culture and tikanga or practices, and not having language in that cultural experience can be a challenge for them. The third key issue is the focus on deficit framing in mainstream culture, both towards people who are aging and Maori culture as well. So these are some of the broad challenges that we're trying to face, and rather than accepting these as the dominant frame, our team, led by the Roa Aoao Kaumatua Charitable Trust, focused on a different approach. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the foundations of who we are, and then I'll continue on about our principles. So our original partnerships, I mentioned the Roa Aoao Kaumatua Charitable Trust. It's a health and social service provider based in Hamilton, New Zealand, and they cater towards the needs of Kaumatua in a variety of contexts. It's a large organization, serves over 600 Kaumatua. It is an organization that was started by Kaumatua, so it has a vision of providing wraparound services. Researchers, including from Maori Studies and the Management School, have been working together for the past 10 years to develop on a number of different projects. In this new project, we brought in some new partners, some researchers from other universities, as well as other 10 health and social service providers. So it's a pretty large collaboration to try to address this. We've seen our common goals. So in the next slide, I'll talk about our particular philosophical approaches towards the foundation of our project. And basically what we're trying to do is center our research around a kaupapa Māori philosophy. That means by Māori, for Māori, or in our case, by Kaumatua, for Kaumatua. So the projects that we have, the research that we're doing is driven by Kaumatua interests. They're part of defining the problem, defining the solutions. So they lead and guide our work. It's also a strength-based approach. So we're focusing on the assets that Kaumatua have, their mana motuhake, their potential, their abilities, their self-actualization. So seeing the strength that they have in the culture and the ability to address their own challenges in a way that's mana or status enhancing. It's also very much a participatory approach. So we work collaboratively from the bottom up, rather than going in and saying, here's what needs to be done. It's the Kaumatua saying, this is what we'd like done. Can you help us? And we work together in this manner. So in the next slide, I want to talk about one of the key elements about our partnership. We call this the Kotahitanga Research Network. And Kotahitanga means unity. So we're looking at how we do this together. And our network is composed of 11 service providers, as well as researchers from 4 different universities. We also have members from the Ministry of Health and other social service agencies that provide expert guidance. And we meet regularly, roughly 2 to 3 times a year, and we find common interests and common goals that we want to work on. It includes, so we're focused on advocacy and capacity development, and trying to develop communication channels to create change. So our form of resistance is to not accept the dominant forms, but to try to use collective advocacy on behalf of Kaumatua. So in the next slide, my final slide is what we're doing is a research perspective is we're developing 2 novel interventions with our research partners that center on Kaumatua capacity and Kaumatua strengths. One is a peer educator model where Kaumatua help other Kaumatua identify service needs and create social connections to address loneliness. The second is a project we call Matoranga Tuku Iho, which basically is knowledge held by Kaumatua, and the project is to help them share their matoranga or knowledge with younger members of their whānau, and also engage in physical activity. So it's kind of combining a couple of aspects. So this is our form of resistance, is to identify strengths that we can use to address key challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Etzel. He's going to pop back in at the end to deliver a short conclusion. And so now we'll carry on to my presentation, which is about a campaign called What We Say Matters. It's a CCA campaign grounded in the voices of some whānau members of the local iwi of Ngāti Kaupata and Fielding, Manawatu, Aotearoa, New Zealand. I am also of Ngāti Kaupata. The campaign is an example of Indigenous resistance against local government attempts at seizing ancestral land in order to build a stop bank to prevent flooding that happens once every 100 years in the region. The photos in this part of the presentation are of an ancestral land occupation by some whānau of Ngāti Kaupata and were taken during the campaign earlier this year. Further information can be found on the hashtag What We Say Matters Facebook page. Professor Mohan Datta, he is the architect of the CCA. The CCA has over 2 decades of cultural centred interventions. Therefore, this panel provides examples of new frontiers of CCA interventions. Indigenous resistance is just one of the examples. In the context of the What We Say Matters campaign, and at the intersections of culture, structure and agency, whānau members articulated their meanings of health and wellbeing. They then came together to form an advisory group, a community advisory group called the Fielding Advisory Group. In these articulations, the oppressive nature of structures, particularly in healthcare, were vividly narrated, and land was identified as an integral part of health and wellbeing. Whānau members within the iwi whose voices aren't typically heard in mainstream and tribal spaces constitute the advisory group. Generally, Indigenous peoples who live in colonial settler states such as Aotearoa, New Zealand, have experienced marginalisation. The CCA delves deeper and looks further to the margins of communities, because structural inequalities, they go hand in hand with communicative inequalities. Building voice infrastructures creates openings for voice as the basis of social change transformation, centering whānau on the margins as the experts of their own realities. As voices emerge into hegemony or mainstream communicative spaces, oppressive processes are unmasked and interrogated. An example in this campaign is the local government stop bank proposal consultation process. It was revealed as inept because most of the kaitiaki, or the landowners, were not consulted, and those that were consulted reported that their voices weren't being listened to. The latter pointed to a deeper concern that even though the stop bank location proposal was rejected by the tribal members, who attended the meetings, consultation meetings, the local government proceeded to possess the remaining ancestral land anyway. If there are any policymakers, government representatives watching, then there is one message I'd like you to hear regarding the modern day confiscation of ancestral land. Don't do it. Exhaust all other options and refrain from attempting a flawed consultation process, which essentially means that it is a tick box exercise. If you do, expect tribal communities to call you out and mobilise. As part of the cultural centred process, I worked with an advisory group constituted organically by the whānau members from the margins of the community. That advisory group had been working with the erasure of their voices when the Stop Bank project started. The decision to occupy the land and protest emerged from dialogue with the advisory group, brainstorming on communication strategies and an overall framework for a campaign and the structure of the campaign. They co-created storyboards and visual materials to voice their feelings of erasure amidst the colonial decision-making process. Richard Torres, CARE technical producer, co-created videos with the whānau. Kowhata Marae trustees opened up the iwi marae, which is just located a few hundred metres down the road, for bathroom and cooking facilities for the land occupiers. In this campaign, no tribal leaders or representatives were present. No iwi academics lent their support, and there are many academics in my iwi. Only myself, Pooja, Jayan, Thara Papaga, Debolina and Professor Mohan Datta from the academe through CARE stood in solidarity with the whānau. There is no water, power or shelter on the land, and the adjacent river is too polluted to access drinking water. This ancestral land occupation was a grassroots effort, built and sustained mostly by whānau living on the margins of our iwi. So my next message, which is a question for tribal leaders and or representatives, how do you build communication infrastructures to ensure that any social justice transformation strategies are grounded in the voices of the margins of your tribe or nation? Please reflect on this, and if you need some assistance, feel free to contact us at CARE. My last question is for Indigenous scholars. How are you placing your bodies on the line in solidarity with marginalised whānau in your tribal nations and with other like-minded scholars of colour in the academy? The path towards social justice transformation requires us to do more than writing articles and presenting. The final and most compelling statements in this presentation is from the voices of the whānau, many of whom comprise the Fielding Advisory Group.
The confiscation of our land was the confiscation of our identity. The negative impact on our people has led to loss of tikanga, loss of language, poverty, homelessness, suicide, high crime rates, addiction, and so much more. Forced and beaten into a colonised way of living. This has affected generations before me and will be felt by generations after me. What we say matters.
Horizons Regional Council, which is local government, ceased the Stop Bank construction on this ancestral land. On the 21st of March 2020, they reinstated the land to the whānau of Ngāti Kaipata. Thank you for watching. I'll now hand back over to Professor John.
Kati ake rā, e mihi ana ki a koto mo o koto totoko. E whakakapi ake ki ngā korero a ngā tupuna. Kaua e mate wheke, mate ururoa. No reira tēnā koto, tēnā koto, tēnā tātou kotoa. I've closed with a whakatoki or proverb that said, don't die like the octopus, die like the hammerhead shark. It's a testament to the importance of resistance and standing up in the face of challenges. And there are different ways to do this, as we've demonstrated in these two presentations. And we hope that this has been useful information for you. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen.
I really enjoyed participating in this session and hearing about all the innovations that are happening with the culture-centered approach. Many of the areas that we outlined today cover aspects of marginalization and deep disenfranchisement. And one of the things that is so beautiful to witness across the various culture-centered interventions globally is the emphasis on turning attention to the structures of knowledge production. So the work of cultural centering in this sense is political work, and the everyday politics of seeking to dismantle hegemonic forms of knowledge production through the participation of subaltern communities in struggles for voice. So the process of knowledge production itself becomes a site for dismantling and interrogating. Culture-centered conversations, as we have seen throughout these different presentations, are not just about the performance of reflexivity at an individual level, but they are a collective invitation for reflexivity at the level of theorizing as an academic community, interrogating our own complicity as academics within hegemonic structures, and then really asking the question, what does it mean to lend our bodies in solidarity to the struggles at the margins, seeking to disrupt and dismantle these structures? So I will sort of summarize this session by drawing upon some of the key questions that kept coming back to me when I listened to these presentations. The first question is about what is an intervention? So the very definition of what makes up an intervention. And as we have seen in culture-centered theorizing, there is a distinct differentiation that is operationalized in terms of conceptualizing what are interventions embedded within the logics of the status quo. These are often called communication for social change or cultural sensitivity approaches that really work in order to disseminate and diffuse the message of the status quo. As opposed to the notion of intervention itself emerging from the margins and seeking to disrupt the structures, disrupt the existing forms of organizing, and disrupt the status quo. In that sense, then, embedded in the idea of a culture-centered intervention is the notion of dismantling the status quo, is the notion of resisting collectively the status quo. We, of course, in many culture-centered projects recognize the importance of micro-practices of resistance as recognition of community agency as communities negotiate extremely disempowering and unequal structures. But through our intervention work, the CCA really works toward articulating what are the ways in which strategic collective identities can be crafted, albeit these are temporary, these are dynamic, these are ever changing. But how can we come from a space of solidarity with subaltern struggles to co-create a specific strategic identity to work from in order to challenge and collectively resist structures? So resistance to hegemonic structures is a key feature of culture-centered interventions. So when we ask the question about what does a transformative opening look like for culture-centered interventions, we have to attend to the ways in which these interventions resist structures, and in that sense really offer us alternatives to the capitalist colonialist hegemony, looking toward socialist organizing, indigenous organizing, organizing of precarious workers, organizing of communities that experience deep racism because of the projects of expulsion and displacement written into neoliberal capital. So theoretical work of the CCA going forward really, I hope, grapples with this question of What does that mean to bring about structural transformation? And what does that process of transforming structures looks like? And then, connected to that is this question of what does it mean to disrupt structures? I think this is something that culture-centered projects really grapple with quite a bit. So is it enough to theoretically describe a text? Is it enough to theoretically interpret a text? What role does theoretical critique or textual critique serve within the context of the actual struggle and the lived struggle for structural transformation? And then this also relates to where we do our work as culture-centered scholars. What does our work look like? So do we publish our works in journals and books? Certainly, as academics inhabiting structures, that is part of our work. But what else do we do outside of that? And in fact, with many culture-centered interventions, the heart of the work is the change work within communities, working in solidarity with communities by placing the body on the line and embodying specific forms of risks that are both material and symbolic to the body, working in solidarity with activists, working in solidarity with community researchers and community advocates, and continually thinking about ways in which these structures can be disrupted. So the nature of work can take the form of petitioning, can take the form of painting street art, performing on the streets, can take the form of running full-fledged campaigns, can take the form of pamphleteering. And of course, also along the spectrum, can take the form of writing white papers, policy briefs, journal articles, books, book chapters. But this is certainly an invitation for us to really think about what do the interventions look like and where do we intervene into the structures to disrupt them? And what does the process of disrupting structures then look like? And particularly within the context of the large-scale co-optation of academia across the globe then, how do we resist this co-optation? How do we challenge it? To conclude then, whether it is within the context of food and ecosystems, whether it is in the context of indigenous organizing, or whether it is in the context of poverty or HIV/AIDS, the process of cultural centering, as we have witnessed in these various conversational threads, is about centering, placing the body of the academic in the midst of struggles, in solidarity with struggles, seeking to transform and dismantle structures. This to me is a vital part of the imaginary of our work going forward, and I really do hope that this offers an important register for how we have conversations within the discipline about the very idea of knowledge generation. Thank you again for participating, for your interest in the culture-centered approach. Please do post your comments and we will come in at different points and respond to them. Please also feel free to write to any of us. Do feel free to write to me. And it's great to have you here. Thank you.